Here's a question from Dave Sampson. Dave says, Adam, one thing that I've been working on lately is the diminished scale, whole half and half whole. It's a confusing topic to say the least. The more I dig into it, the more confusing it becomes. I would love to both understand the theory and the practical uses of it. I like the outside sound, but it doesn't work over everything. Appreciate any help. So, yeah, let's get into it. Before I answer Dave's question, I want to just define something that he mentions in his question, which is whole half and half whole. So if that's new to you, what he's talking about there, the whole half is shorthand for this scale that's constructed alternately of whole step, half step, whole step, half step, and so on. So rather than saying the name of the scale by, or spelling out the whole thing, we just say whole half, and we know that it continues from there. And there's another version that goes half whole. So to illustrate that, pick up your guitar if you have it handy, and we're going to do all of this on one string, the G string. And if we go whole step, remember a whole step is 2 frets and a half step is 1. So from G we can go whole, half, whole, half, whole, half, whole, half. When we come back down, it's coming down from G, this we would actually start with a half step going down. Whole, half, whole, half, whole, half, whole. But we name it from the ascending version. So whole, half, whole, half, whole, half, whole, half. So that is related to a G diminished. One way of looking at it is it's a G diminished 7th arpeggio. And then that's 4 of the 8 notes. This is an 8-note scale. The other 4 notes are a whole step up from all of those chord tones. So we go whole step, and then this was the next chord tone from G diminished, up a whole step. This was the next chord tone, up a whole step. Next chord tone, up a whole step. So like that. So here's the arpeggio, and then we add these other notes. So that's whole half, and that relates to G diminished. It's a we could call it a symmetrical 8-note diminished scale. There's also the half whole, which would go from G again, half step, whole step, half step, whole step, half step, whole step, half step, whole step. And that relates not to G diminished, but to G7 with a flat 9. It's in this diminished family, but I tend to think of that as a symmetrical dominant because we're going to use it for dominant quality. So you with me so far? Already this is pretty heady, but that's the basic idea of it. So when Dave says the whole half and the half whole, that's what he's talking about. Now, for the rest of this lesson, we're not going to be going up and down one string, but we're going to be playing in position, which is the way that I think most of us are going to play most of the time. But it's easier to see the construction of it up and down one string. So now go to this PDF that's attached to this lesson, and you'll see this chord. This is G7. Hopefully you know this. If you don't, you might recognize it as part of this G7 bar chord. And then the next shape is G7 flat 9. It's the same notes basically, but instead of G on top, which is the root of this dominant chord, we're putting A flat on top, which is the flat 9 on G7. And then if you look at the third shape, it's a A flat diminished seventh, and you don't have to do it with a bar. You could do either of these last two chords with 4 fingers or with a bar, as you like. But you'll notice that A flat diminished seventh and G7 flat 9 are the same grip, same notes. So they're closely related in sound and shape. And so these two scales, the whole half and the half whole, we're going to see how they relate to these chords. First, I want to back up and go to this first chord, G7. If you saw G7 on a chord chart, rather than getting into any kind of fancy half whole, whole half, whatever, you probably would play G Mixolydian, which is on the PDF. And even if you didn't know theory, that's probably where your ear would lead you if you were just trying to find notes that were complementary to this. Right? So that's G Mixolydian. But now let's look at G half whole, which is the symmetrical dominant. It's a dominant seventh chord, or it's a scale, and it's got the flat 9, the sharp 9, the sharp 11, and the 13. So on G7, we've got flat 9, sharp 9, sharp 11, and 13, all within that scale. So there's a lot of color. So that sounds like this. And hope it doesn't throw you off that all of a sudden we're in 9/8. You don't have to play this in time. I just changed it from regular 4/4 time to 9/8 because, like Mixolydian, as this is true of major scales and all of their modes, there's 7 notes and then it repeats at the octave. So if you write it out as an 8th note phrase, you can get the whole, you can go from G to G in one measure. These symmetrical scales, actually, to get from G to G, there's 8 notes and then the octave. So that's why it's in 9/8. So it starts on G and ends on G. That's why. So then the last scale on this page is A flat whole half. So we're going to now start on A flat and go whole half, whole half, whole half, whole half. And you'll notice it's really the same fingering and same notes and same sound as the G half whole. So G half whole and A flat whole half are the same, but we would apply them differently. G half whole is going to be great over G7, G7 flat 9, G7 sharp 9, G7 sharp 11, any combination of those. This is flat 9, sharp 11. A flat whole half is going to be great when we're actually thinking about a diminished chord. Right? So play with those a little bit and get comfortable with those, and then we're going to go to page 2, which to Dave's question about what are the practical uses. How about let's play over a 12-bar blues in G. And so I've created a little backing track, which I'll include for you. But let me just play over it. Hopefully this will sound okay. So this is all kind of Mixolydian. was I doing there in my improvisation? Was I throwing this half whole sound onto every dominant chord that came up? No. That is going to just probably sound like a mess. You know, in blues and jazz and all of the kind of overlap of blues and jazz, we see a lot of dominant chords, but not all dominant chords are created equal, and that's an important lesson here. There are functional dominant chords and non-functional dominant chords, and to implement this scale, this half-whole scale, we need to be able to distinguish between them. So if G7 goes to C, or G7 goes to C minor, or even if G7 goes to C7, then we could say it's a functional dominant chord. A functional dominant chord is resolving by going clockwise one tick around the circle of fourths. So G7 to C major, minor, or even dominant, we could say that G is the 5 of C, and so it is a functional dominant chord. Whereas, like, if I just play this as a turnaround, let's say, at the end of a blues, that's not what's on the page here, but let's say the last 4 bars is A minor 7, D7, and I decided I wanted to play this as a turnaround, G7, B flat 7, E flat 7 or E flat 9, D7, sharp 9. Which of those chords is a functional dominant chord? And so let's look at it. The first chord, G7, I would say is not functional because of what follows it. It's followed by B flat 7, so that's not a functional dominant chord, the G7. The B flat 7 is functional because it's going around the circle from B flat to E flat. So that might be a place to get some tension. E flat 7. E flat 7 goes down a half step to D, so that is not a functioning dominant chord. But once we get to the D7 sharp 9, well, it's got a sharp 9 on it. That's another factor. If a dominant chord, if it tells you in the name of the dominant chord, if it's got flat 9 or sharp 9 or both, if it's got sharp 9, sharp 11, if it's got flat 9 and 13, any combination of the extensions and alterations that you see on page 1, that'd be great. So if it's a functional dominant chord, and or if it's got these alterations already written into it. The reason that we can do it on a functional dominant, even if it doesn't ask for it, is just there's already tension inherent in a D7. It has to resolve to G. We're just adding more tension, like it's already tangy. Let's just keep piling it on. We wouldn't maybe do that all the time, but it's you can do that. When it's a non-functional dominant chord, then you want to leave it alone. This maybe wants E flat mixolydian, or maybe E flat Lydian dominant. Right? That's maybe for another lesson, but only to say that's not a place where I would put this sound. So try it out in a blues. I'm going to include the backing track that I made so you can play along. There's also a diminished chord in it. There's a C sharp diminished 7th. So that would be a place where you could play the whole half. So C sharp diminished 7th, you go whole step, half step, whole step, half step. If we want to stay over here, whole step, half step, whole step, half step, whole step, half step, whole step, half step, whole step, half step. So that would be a place to experiment with that. As always, in any situation where I say this scale goes over this chord, you don't have to play the whole scale. Just play a couple notes. Start down low and play the first few, or start at the octave and play down a few, or skip around. Don't ever feel you have to play all 7 or 8 or 9 or however many notes there are just because somebody says, oh, this scale goes over this chord. That doesn't mean literally the whole scale is meant to go there. It just means that they have a kind of a correlative sound. So you can use notes from the chord and notes from the scale, and they complement each other. They're from the same system. So Dave and everyone else, I hope this is helpful. There's so much more that I could or would say about these sounds, but I think one of the reasons that this stuff can get confusing is that people say too much about it. They start to tell you like, oh, and once you can do that, you can do this, and you can do that, and you can do this, and you can do that. What I've tried to do in this lesson is just show you how you could apply it in a real life situation, a 12-bar blues. Play with that. Get these sounds under your fingers. If you want to try doing it on one string, if you like that, go for it. I think playing in position is going to be a little more useful down the road. Get into it, make mistakes, try stuff, record yourself. If you want to send me something you're working on, I'd love to hear it. And if you have more questions about this, or if you need me to clarify anything in this lesson, let me know. I want this to be as helpful as it can be. All right. Thanks, Dave, for a great question. And I'll be back with a couple more of these throughout the month.